Hello everyone, and once again welcome to my channel. My name is Praful Raj, and my channel is about insightful conversation with economists and professors about the Indian economy. So today our special guest is Dr. Radhika Pandey, a senior fellow at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Is a renowned economist with a diverse background. She has a PhD and MA in economics from JNV University and a bachelor's from BHU. Dr. Radhika Pandey has served as a lead contributor for the Ministry of Finance Task Force on Public Debt Management Agency. She has also been involved in the various research teams, including those for the Working Group on the Foreign Investments and the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission. Her areas of expertise include business cycles, capital controls, and financial sector regulation. Additionally, Dr. Pandey is a prolific writer known for her weekly column Macro Sutra, which delves into contemporary macroeconomic issues published in the print. So, welcome, ma'am. I'm privileged to have you as my esteemed guest in my channel and joining me for this conversation. Today, we are here to talk about on a topic which actually impacts everyone individual's pocket. Okay, that is inflation, which is quantified through consumer price index, which is commonly known as CPI, and headline inflation. So, in simple English, inflation is basically increase in a general level of price for goods and services in an economy over a time period. So, and to calculate it in India, there are 448 items, approximately a basket of 448 items, which for their prices are being tracked to calculate it. For example, items of food category, the fuel, energy, clothing, among others. And especially in India, the weightage to food is given approximately 46%, which depends on economy to economy, country to country. So starting with the first question, before that, I'll give you just a small introduction for the question that, in last 1.5 years, and it's been very common over the other economies also, like every economist, policymakers, and the world financial banks are talking about this inflation and growth. And this is across the globe, and across the globe, the central banks are also grapple with the complexities to manage inflation. So, for example, in US, March inflation was 5.5%, approximately 5%. In India, it's 5.6%. And in European countries, it's approximately 6.9%, which is very high. So my first question to you, ma'am, is like, how is this inflation is actually impacting the common people? I mean, who are marginalized section of society. And second, what policy, interventions are done to mitigate this impact? So here you go, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Praful, for having me. And it's a very interesting conversation. Yes, so let us begin with the discussion. We talked about inflation. Uh, inflation is like, it's a regressive tax. It is going to impact the common people or people who are at the who are low income bracket, or the people who are at the lower end of the spectrum. They will be impacted more by inflation, because inflation impacts the purchasing power of people. And particularly in India, where most of the purchasing power goes towards purchasing food, and
Yes.
if therefore the prices of food rises, it impacts the purchasing power, and then it squeezes the expenditure which could have been done on other items. So other discretionary spending, like on, say, consumer durables and other goods, would suffer, because first the individuals are grappling to meet their basic necessities.
Yes.
So that is the reason why inflation is a big challenge for all economies, and therefore both the government and the central bank tries to address inflation through different measures. So central bank tries to do through monetary policy, and the only tool it has at its disposal is the interest rate. So whenever inflation is rising, the central bank tries to raise the interest rate, so that there is less purchasing power, there is less demand. Sorry, not less purchasing power, less demand, and therefore prices cool down. But when prices are mostly driven by supply side disruption, for example, during COVID times, we saw that because of the lockdown in India, It was not possible to move items from one state to another. There were logistic problems, there were supply side bottlenecks. So those kind of the reasons cannot be just addressed by monetary policy, and therefore then the role of the central government is very important. And central government, what it tries to do, it tries to reduce taxes, it tries to reduce import duties. For example, if inflation is rising through crude oil, because we know that India imports more than 80% of its domestic crude oil requirement is through imports. And if the prices of crude oil rises, then it will lead to increase in prices of petrol, diesel, and when the transportation cost rises, the prices of all other commodities will also rise.
Yes.
Therefore, the government tries to intervene through reduction in duties, through providing subsidies. So, conventional fiscal policy instruments like taxation and subsidies are used as tools of intervention to cool inflation. And they have been used progressively, particularly in India. They have been used progressively over the last 2 years because of rise in oil prices, because of rise in edible oil prices, because we are importing edible oils also. We import sunflower oil, we import palm oil, sunflower oil from Russia and Ukraine, and
Ukraine.
prices rose. So then the government had to reduce the import duties. So again, because inflation is a challenge and it disproportionately impacts the sections of the population that are vulnerable, therefore both the government and the central bank, they have to address this through different intervention tools. Central bank through monetary policy, and the government through fiscal policy.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that yes, I mean it depends. Like supply side also there's kind of inflation, which COVID saw the supply side mainly inflation, which actually impact
Yes, supply.
because of less supply, the demand increases with the less demand. So there's a supply and demand, both side inflation kind of came into the same time, and government takes both monetary
Yes,
and fiscal policy. But one question, so basically we know that India, like in last few years, India was trying to come to the inflation level of 4%, right? Like for example, US target
right.
for inflation is approximately near to 2%.
2%.
Do you think that we are reaching towards like we would have reached if the COVID would have not come, like because 4% target for developing countries inflation is kind of very good for the economy, and we almost like it's 1% near, 1.5% near will be. So what do you say on that, like 4% inflation?
See, in hindsight, if we see, inflation had started rising in 2019. Towards the end of 2019, inflation had started rising. But in January and February, it cooled down. And therefore, if you are right, if we would not have been impacted by these multiple shocks, like first COVID and then the Russia-Ukraine war, the trajectory of inflation would have been different.
Different, yes.
And therefore the causes, the driving forces would also, if at all, would have been different. At this time around, inflation is mostly driven by, uh, particularly during the Russia Ukraine war, by external headwinds, because of increase in the prices of commodities, because of increase in the prices of edible oils, crude oil, industrial raw materials. So China locking up its economy, that resulted in again increase in prices of industrial raw materials like aluminium and other. There was also a chip shortage, which the
Yes,
automobile sector
semiconductor.
uses.
Yeah.
Yes, so that again impacted the inflation.
So in the recent March 23, as per the data shows that the inflation is 16-month low, which is 5.6%. And considering the weightage of food in the overall component of this inflation, which is 46%. So what actually is driving this food inflation? We know that like sunflower and all are coming from Russia and Ukraine, but in food category, there must be so many other items like milk, cereal. So why this is, especially we are a agriculture country and we have cows, and we pray cow in India, so why milk and cereal price are also getting high? What's your opinion on that?
So, yeah, cereal prices are getting high. For that, we have to look at what happened last year. So, last year, what happened was that we are a cereal exporter, wheat exporter country. But so farmers started exporting wheat in the international market because they were getting more prices, because the supplies of wheat from Ukraine was stalled because of the war. Therefore, India started exporting wheat. So farmers started exporting, they started selling wheat in the international market because they were getting higher prices in the international market. So one option is that they, sell to the government. So government procures wheat from the farmers, and then they store it in their public distribution system godown, and from there they distribute to the under the for the below poverty line people and so on. But because of this factor that farmers started selling in the international market, the procurement by the government drastically reduced in 2022. So that was one factor. The second factor was that there were unseasonal rains, and then there was very high temperature that impacted the crop of wheat, and it shriveled. So that also affected the production of wheat. So one was that the supply got limited because there was more supply in the international market because farmers were getting higher prices. And secondly, the production, because government thought that they will be able to replenish because of higher production, but that did not happen because of adverse climatic conditions last year, which resulted in shriveling of the grain, and therefore production was impacted. So that resulted in increase in prices of cereals. There was increase in prices of both wheat and rice, and the entire the second half of 2022, we saw elevated cereal inflation, double digit cereal inflation, which was never the case in India, because cereal prices have always remained suppressed in India because we always have a surplus. Our
Surplus.
godowns are filled with wheat production and wheat supply. So that never happened. And then the other factor that resulted in supply shortage was that the government was providing free food grains under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. So that was also one reason that till December 2022, government was providing 5 kg of free food grains. So uh, it was the government was not able to replenish its procurement process. It was not able to replenish its stock, and the stock was dwindling because since COVID, the government had introduced this free food grain scheme, Garib Kalyan Yojana, under which it was providing free food grain. So all these factors in culmination resulted in diminished stock of wheat with the government, and therefore rise in price of wheat. And therefore, whenever there is increase in the cereal prices, again we see that the rural people are impacted more than the urban population, because if you look at the consumption pattern of rural and urban, the cereals has a higher weight in the rural inflation. So that was the reason that in most of the months of 2022, we saw that the rural inflation was higher than urban inflation. So that was the cereal inflation story, and the milk inflation is because of increase in feed cost. Feed cost, the things that the cow eats, that production has suffered a lot, and therefore the prices of milk has risen to an elevated level. That continues to remain a problem, and therefore even we are hopeful now that the cereal prices will come down, because the Food Corporation of India has started offloading some stock in the open market. And now we've had good rabi crop, even though in March there were again some unseasonal rain, but it would not have a very adverse impact on the wheat production. So we hope to replenish our wheat stocks, and therefore the cereal prices have started coming down. Even when you look at, we have something called daily data on all these commodities. We have March inflation data, but we also have daily prices, and it gives us some early indications about prices. And we can say with certainty that cereal prices will come down, pulses also will come down, edible oils will come down, but what is again elevated is the milk price.
The milk price. So it's kind of supply side, again a supply side issue. So I just one question out of curiosity. So basically, as you mentioned, that farmers are selling their crops in the international market because this is like, of course, getting a higher price. Then why government is not buying those and subsidizing it for common people? Like, is it our government does this kind of thing when farmers started selling to the international market?
So when farmers started selling in international markets, after some time, the government banned the exports of wheat.
Okay, okay.
And therefore, then farmers were not able to sell in the international market because first, every government's first priority is to cater to the
Okay.
domestic requirement.
Yes.
And even at that time, if you read the statements around that time of WTO and IMF, they started criticizing India, saying that you are a wheat surplus country. Please cater to the needs of other countries. But then our government said that first we have to meet our own population, the requirements of our own population, and so therefore exports of wheat was stopped. It was banned, and they only on country to country basis, on official basis, it was possible to provide wheat to countries, which were suffering a lot due to the Russia-Ukraine war and who are wheat importers. But on commercial reasons, there was a ban on exports of wheat by farmers. So only through the government route
You
exports
can do
could
that.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So therefore, when it started happening, the government intervened and it banned the exports of wheat, and therefore then farmers started again selling to the government. But by that time, the new crop of wheat also had suffered, and therefore, and then as I said, that government was also providing wheat under the free food grain scheme. So all these factors in culmination impacted, led to higher cereal prices.
Yeah, basically by the time government realizes that okay, we are having a wheat shortage, by the time it bends, so by the time it has actually decreased, the quantity actually decreased. Okay. So
Yeah.
so I think we are like we understood exactly the food inflation, why it is making it. And it's a both supply side and demand side issue. Supply side is basically like we don't have any control like on whether with this climate change.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and fuel, we know energy and fuel, that's not in our hand. But one thing you mentioned that ma'am, that during the crisis happening in the last 2 years, the fuel prices increased, and the other food prices. But at that point of time only, India imported crude oil from Russia, which is
Russia.
a
Yeah.
very low rate. So is that little bit quantified the impact of other inflation, or it's kind of almost remains same?
So we started importing subsidized oil, crude oil from Russia, but it was not catering to our entire oil needs. We were
Yes,
still
of course.
buying from other countries also. We were buying from Iraq, we were buying from Saudi Arabia, we were buying from US and other countries. So slowly and gradually, the share of Russia in our imports has increased. But it has only happened now. Now Russia has become a second highest importer of oil for us, and earlier it was nowhere. Its position was very low. We were hardly having any trade ties, particularly on crude oil with Russia. So had it not been the case, the impact would have been even more adverse for India, and therefore right now we have seen that government has not passed so much of an increase in international prices to consumers in the form of higher prices of petrol and diesel. Had that not been the case, it may well have been that the final prices of diesel and petrol would have risen even more. So all these things are there, and the other thing is that in between, whenever so oil prices are very volatile.
Volatile,
Oil
yeah.
prices in between, oil prices fell, then again it started rising. So the government has also introduced something called the windfall tax on oil refineries. Whenever the price has fallen drastically and oil refineries are making profit on that, then the government puts some tax on that windfall. Whereas when the international prices start rising, then that windfall tax is removed. So that is also one lever that the government has introduced to cool prices and also to get some revenue, because fiscal deficit is also a problem. Uh, Expenditure of government has increased manifold last year because government provided firstly free food grain. Government also provided subsidies to farmers
Yes.
because fertilizer prices were also rising. So that is also another component of inflation, because all the inputs for fertilizers were also rising. So there also the government provided subsidies to farmers. So all these things led to higher spending by the government, and government introduced these small measures to get some revenue when oil refiners are making windfall gains.
Got it, got it. So, yeah, I mean, the problem is that the population we cater is 150 crores. Like in the
Yeah.
small amount of change actually does not actually have a higher impact. It first of all, the impact should be very high. I mean, we need a quantity and quality, and plus it should be over a period of time. It's not a 1 month or six
Yes.
thing that will actually impact.
Yes.
Okay. So, like,
Yes.
have almost discussed about the main components of inflation that actually hampers everyone's pocket. So here we'll also move towards a little bit of a policy side, like how this. So do you think that RBI, who is a everyone's banker's bank, need to revisit the calculation methodology of inflation, like maybe including something which is very important in today's trend and excluding which was like maybe important in last few years but not now. And so basically maybe changing of the base year or some weightage is something which I also feel like weightage to food 46% is comparatively very high compared to others. So what do you think on that? And we also know that in last 2012 or 2013, when Raghuram Rajan was there as an RBI governor, he changed it from WTI wholesale price index to CPI. That was very obvious. I don't know like for how many years it has not been changed. But now what do you have on this to say?
See, first of all, the weighting and the composition of CPI is not decided by the RBI. So we should know that in 2016, RBI became an inflation targeting central bank, and it was given the mandate that it should target CPI. Whatever is there in CPI, whatever other commodity basket, composition, weights, it is taken as it is. Now, let us understand how the CPI, the weights in the CPI basket is determined. The weights are determined based on a survey which is conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization under the CSO, under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. What they do is that they are required to do this survey every 10 years to understand the expenditure of consumers on various consumption items. So this was done last in 2011. So in 2011, people are asked, the NSSO conducts this survey where people are asked, how much do you spend on food? How much do you spend on cereal, rice? So what is termed as the per capita consumption expenditure. So based on the per capita consumption expenditure of a typical household in both rural area and the urban areas, the weights are determined. And this household can be a remote village in Himachal Pradesh or an urban area in Maharashtra. So therefore, the weights of all the rural and urban areas in the various states are also different, and then they are aggregated to come up with an all India CPI. So if you look at the weights of, it's very interesting. If you look at the weights in Bihar, and if you look at the commodity composition in Maharashtra, it's different. If you look at
Yes.
the, even in Bihar, if you look at the rural and urban commodity composition, they are different. In rural, understandably, the weight will be higher for food as compared to an urban region.
Urban region.
So these weights are essentially coming from the it's coming from the survey which is conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization to assess the monthly expenditure of consumers of a typical household on different items. So based on that, they come up with these weights. So now they are supposed to do this exercise, this survey exercise periodically It was done in 2011-12, and therefore the CPI's base, the consumer price index base year is also 2012. Then it did a survey. A survey was done in 2017-18, but it was shelved because of reasons that it's just a very abnormal year. It was the year after demonetization, so all the the findings were not very representative of a normal year. So
No.
the survey was done, but the findings of the survey were shelved. It was those weights that came out from that survey were not incorporated. So now it is high time that again a fresh survey needs to be conducted to assess the consumers' spending pattern, how they are spending, on which commodity they are spending. Because as of now, we are basing our inflation study on the basis of weights that are based on 2011-12 consumption spending pattern. So that needs to change, and that is where this this question that you have asked is very relevant. And many people have written about it, that it's high time that we revisit the weights, see that still whether 46% of the consumer expenditure is going on food. Are there some new items? Are there some outdated items we need to remove? Are there some items which are distorting the entire CPI basket?
Yeah, basket,
Is
yes.
there a need to is there a need to incorporate more services? So if you look at the US CPI and our CPI, it's completely different. US
Completely.
CPI,
Yeah.
yeah. So in US CPI, they give more weightage to services. Here in our basket, it's mostly goods, and services has a very small component. So all these things, as the structure of the economy changes, as the spending pattern of people change, the consumption basket needs to be revised, and that will give a better picture about the CPI. So CPI, as of now, whatever we are getting, it may be underestimated, it may be overestimated, we do not know, because we are still uh, basing our analysis on the basis of weights. So CPI is what? It's like a last pairs index, P into Q,
You
where
in
you are taking the yeah. So the Q
price
is
increase.
constant because Q is the weight.
Wait.
Yeah. So Q is the weight which is constant, and you are just multiplying with the price. So if the weights change, this entire index will change. So that is the relevant point to be considered here.
So you talked about the US inflation, the concentration of US inflation. So in US inflation, housing utility is something is the highest.
Yes.
Housing
Yes.
utilities, and
Yes.
then it comes food and other services. So I mean, and also one more thing, like so US is a population of 330 million, which 33 crores approximately, and they survey around 80,000 people on a very regular
Mhm.
basis. I exactly don't remember
Correct.
on a very regular basis.
Yes.
So like first question will be, I mean, this will be last question, because this topic is so intriguing that it will keep going and going. So one question, like, first of all, how many like what percentage of population that India covers? I know it's difficult, but and why, what component is giving to housing? Because in India, housing is something very important, and I don't think so, because fuel, energy, food is almost taken, I mean, a majority part of the component. So like, what do you say on that percentage of population contributing to the survey, if you remember? Like,
Uh, it's that I do not know, because that is on states basis. So they do not have a fixed
big number.
number as such. Yeah, they do not have a fixed number as such. That keeps changing. But on the housing part, it's very interesting that the weight of housing for rural CPI is zero.
Root.
It's only the urban CPI which has housing component, whereas the rural CPI does not have housing component. Housing weight in rural CPI is zero. It's only the urban CPI which has a weight. And if we have, if we have done an analysis of the various drivers of inflation in India, and there have been housing has remained more or less stable, unlike in US, where shelter costs have influenced US CPI, and therefore we look at the US CPI excluding shelter, US CPI
Yes.
including shelter. So we have various series in the US, because housing has a very higher high component weightage is very high, and the prices are also very high, and therefore there it has to be seen excluding housing and including housing. But in India, the contribution of housing to CPI has been more or less stable. It was only during the pay commission recommendation, in 2015, when pay commission announced a pay hike for central government employees, and the state pay commission also increased the salaries, that there were increase in the housing prices because people got money in their hands and they spent on houses. So that was the only period where housing prices were the key driver of CPI inflation. Otherwise, that's a key difference between Indian CPI and US CPI. That here it's mainly a goods story. It's not services and it's
Yes.
not housing. Whereas in US it's mostly services, and therefore the US Fed has also said that now we have won the battle on goods inflation, and now we need to see how to tackle services inflation.
Services industry. Okay, great. I think we got a good amount of information on our inflation economy, like how it function. I hope this will help our audience to understand much better. Just talking about headline CPI, it is CPI. It's more of integrate. And the milk was shocking. The milk inflation, which I really like. I didn't even read this in paper, so thank you for that. So thank you
Hmm.
so much, ma'am, for joining us. And I hope it will be liked by my audience. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.